control. But there are many ways to be enslaved. Many ways we are still being enslaved. There's 4 of them. And I'm going to show you how slavery is still happening in many forms here in America, and we're willingly doing it to ourselves. First, there's a slave to a master, slave to debt, slave to illiteracy, and slave to ignorance. Let's start at the beginning. Slave to a master. We know this one. We're familiar with slave masters and slavery and how it is to be enslaved by another person, being forced to do things, go pick cotton or whatever it was, work on a plantation. This is one of the most famous pictures from the Civil War. This is a guy whose back is from the lash of a slave master. This is one of the pictures that actually turned everything around because people were so horrified by it. This isn't happening here anymore like that, but there are still slaves in America. There are sex slaves. There are prostitutes. There are kids that are forced to sell themselves, find themselves out on the street. They're a pimp and they can't break free. But the biggest example of this kind of slavery, I contend, is illegal immigration. Illegal immigrants are the modern-day slave. But this is a much more complex problem than anybody is making it out in Washington. They always focus on the slave, and the solution is either, well, just tell them that they're all free, or they'll say, send them all back. But nobody ever talks about going after the slave masters, the owners of the companies and the politicians that are actually enslaving people. Slave wages. No one, again, is going to the slave master. And once again, the slave master, the politician, those in power and the companies divert attention, and the average person is left with all of the cost. These modern-day slave masters are making people dependent on a political party, a political system, and a company instead of relying on themselves. All right. Second one is slave to debt. The government now is $16 trillion in debt, or just about $16 trillion. Debt per citizen, right there, $50,343. Now, this is a debt you can't pay. Over $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Good luck with that. The government has racked up a debt of over $50,000 per person in the United States. Now, so you know, that's up $15,000 per person since Obama took office. So we know how bad the government sucks. But what about the rest of us as individuals? That's the debt they ran up for us. But what are we doing? Bring the debt clock back. 43% of households spend more than they earn right now. More than they take in every year, 43%. The average American is going to spend about $600,000 on interest over their lifetime. And here it is. Go back to the original debt clock, please. Total personal debt is $16 trillion. We have more personal debt than we do as a nation. $15,955 billion. $15,796. Our mortgage debt is $13 trillion. Student loan debt, $870 billion. Credit card debt, $856 billion, which brings us here. The personal debt per citizen, $50,000. Add that $50,000 to this $50,000. You're $100,000 in debt. On average, people have $25,000 in college loan. $6,400 on credit cards. That's the average. So what does that do? What does that do to you? If you're a slave to debt, remember, being under the domination of some influence or person. Influence, the banker, your boss. You have to do what others tell you because you're a slave to debt. Debt causes people to make life choices they normally wouldn't. We just showed you the first one, sex slaves. How many times have we seen murder mysteries? You know, you watch some Matlock or Columbo or something like that, and you're watching it, and they're like, I wonder who might do it. And then halfway through the show, they're like, hey, he's like riddled with debt. And everybody in the room goes, oh, yeah, he killed her. One woman, an attorney, couldn't find a job, and her student loan debts were so crushing she had to take drastic measures, according to MSNBC, and we know they never tell us anything but the truth. As a little girl, I never thought to myself I just want to grow up and be a stripper, or all I ever wanted to do in life is climb on the lap of a sweaty stranger and take my top off. But with the economy the way it is, especially smaller cities, you strip or you starve. Sometimes it sucks, it's degrading, and I hate it. But it's necessary right now. No, it's not necessary right now. I'm sorry, Carla, but it's not. This obviously goes against everything she knows is right, and yet, because she's a slave to debt and a slave to her passions, she does it. There are very few people in our society, if really any at all, that are really truly a slave to debt. There's nobody, when she said you strip or you starve, that's not true. Nobody's going to let anyone in America starve to death. Now, if you want sneakers and the right clothes and you want the certain lifestyle or college, the education that you wanted, you may choose to strip, but you're not forced to. It still is your choice. True slavery is not a choice, but we're doing it to ourselves. People are literally working themselves to death in order to pay the debt. No, not in America. Kind of. Last year, one woman died right at her desk. Nobody even noticed right away because, according to a coworker, she was, quote, always working, always working. Now, was she a slave to debt, or was she just a slave to work? Was she a workaholic? Either way, she did it to herself. Who do you think is buying that shackle shoe? You see Warren Buffett walking into a... No. Jon Stewart? No. I'm guessing it would go against their country club dress codes. People who can afford those shoes aren't buying them. People who generally can't afford $350 sneakers, they'd be the ones lining up for them. There is something that is missing inside of each of us, and we are trying to fill it with stupid sneakers, stuff, TV shows, whatever it is. I can personally attest to you, the more you spend, the less happy you are. I mean, temporarily, I guess you're happy. It's great, but it doesn't last. And as anyone who listened to the radio show today can tell you, it doesn't last long. I'm collecting kind of cool old stuff. This was a very dirty fishbowl yesterday. I won it at an auction. It was a fishbowl. You can still see a little bit of the octopus that was on here. Can you see that? See the octopus right there? They had like a mermaid and everything. It was drawn on here, and it was signed by Orson Welles. He made this, a long time ago, and somebody had kept it. In fact, it was in his estate until 1991. So somebody had, hung on to this for like 50 years. I had it for a day. And then a very hard-working cleaning crew came in, and they saw the dirty fishbowl and thought it should be cleaned, and so they scrubbed it to get all that stuff off. Anyway, happiness doesn't come from material things, and even when it does, usually lasts, well, sometimes more than a day, but not always. Especially when you're surrounded by really efficient overachievers. I just talked to this poor woman. She's so sweet. She's the one who cleaned the fishbowl last night. She's like, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I'm like, no, she did the right thing. For the one time we get somebody who's like really in there, usually you're like, can somebody clean the carpet? Can somebody pick anything up? No, she saw a dirty fishbowl and she decided to clean it. God bless her. Hard to complain. Okay. Third one is slave to illiteracy. African Americans were not allowed to read during slavery. Why? It's obvious. Owners knew the more educated a person was, the more they could read or write, the better chance they'd figure out at saying, I shouldn't be a slave. I should be free. Today, our schools are failing us. They are enslaving our children. America is one of the top spenders on education. $2 trillion in the last 44 years. But when it comes to results, we're not really getting that payoff. There's an entire chapter in my new book, Cowards, that came out last week just to prove it. Out of 34 civilized countries, American kids rank 25th in math, 14th in reading, 17th in science. In 2010, just 20% of fourth graders, 17% of eighth graders, 12% of 12th graders were proficient in U.S. history. How do we expect to be free when those stats sit there? Can't. Can't have a civilization that will protect itself and remain free if only 12% know its history, where we came from. We're getting a bunch of kids also who hate the free market. In a response to our obvious education issues, President Obama has actually lowered the standards. He's just recently caved to schools who were complaining because they couldn't meet the federal standards. They can't get those test scores. So he granted them waivers from the standards. Who loves their children and then says, you know what, you can't make it? I tell you what, skate on that one. You become a slave to illiteracy. And the last one is slave to ignorance. How many friends do you personally have who don't pay attention to the news whatsoever? And they'll always say the same excuse. I can't watch it. It's all the same. It's too depressing. Whatever. They can't tell you what's happening in Greece. They can't tell you what's happening with the EU. They think QE3 is some, I don't know, is that a game show? Oh, no, dummy. That's that English boat, the QE3. They have no idea who George Soros is, and if they do, they think he's a nice guy because they don't know anything else about him. If Americans don't know what's going on, guess what? There is somebody like George Soros who's more than willing to pay attention for you and make all of your decisions. Do you remember when I did the show about the cattle and the ranchers? I was over at Fox. And I drew out the ranch and the cowboys there, and I showed you that the progressives are the ranchers. And they look at us like cattle, and they just herd us, and they just want to keep us penned in for our own protection. Just keep us penned in. We're incapable of making our own decisions. Mayor Bloomberg in New York City is doing that right now, banning sodas larger than 16 ounces. Now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the home of Harvard University, they've issued a policy order to get rid of all soda, no matter what size, in all restaurants. Have a good time with that one, Massachusetts. I don't think I'm coming to visit you. Oh, are you disappointed? Me too. We're being enslaved to the system in every aspect of our life, right down to how many sips we can take of a Slurpee in one sitting. And while we sit around watching American Ninja Warrior, the states ran up $1 trillion pension gap. Well, how did that happen? Whose fault is that? The ones who are ignorant? The ones who are in self-imposed ignorance? The ones that were convinced by local politicians and labor unions? The state workers who went along with it, knowing there's no possible way, if you weren't a slave to ignorance, there's no possible way that this system will work. But everybody valued their pensions or their power more than reality. And now, we're all being forced to do what we don't want to do. Change our lifestyle. Make cuts. Slaves don't like that. The ones enslaved from to the lies from the government and to their unions are not happy. I'm gonna read something to you from. Would you mind taking this for me? I'm gonna read this from Booker T. Washington. It's Up from Slavery. It's pretty amazing. It's an autobiography of Booker T. This is the reason why we don't pay attention. Among a large class, there seemed to be a dependence upon the government for every conceivable thing. The members of this class had little ambition to create a position for themselves, but wanted the federal officials to create one for them. How many times I wished then, and have wished since, that by some power of magic I might remove the great bulk of these people into the country districts and plant them among the soil, upon the solid and never deceptive foundation of Mother Nature, where all nations and races that have ever succeeded got their start. A start that may first be slow and toilsome, but one that is nonetheless real. He's talking about a time after slaves, and he went to Washington and he's like, what are you doing? You African Americans, what are you doing? You're enslaving yourself. It's not a black thing. It's a people thing. One more thing. On page 21 is a story about how he found out that he was free. He was still small. He had watched his mother by her bedside in their little hut as she prayed on her knees for Abraham Lincoln. He didn't really even know who Abraham Lincoln was. He talked about a day when the soldier came, somebody in a uniform, and read a declaration that they were all free. He said, after reading, we were told that we were all free and we could go wherever we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children with tears of joy running down her cheeks. She explained to us what it all meant, that this was the day which she had been so long praying, but fearing she would never live to see. For some minutes, there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, there was pity among the slaves for our former owners. Their wild rejoicing on the part of the emancipated colored people lasted, however, but for a brief period. For I noticed that by the time they returned to their cabins, there was a change in their feeling. Listen carefully. There was a responsibility of being free, of having to have charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children. It seemed to take possession of them. It was very much like suddenly turning the youth of 10 or 12 years out into the world to provide for himself. That's why we don't do it. Because it's scary. Because there's responsibility. It's hard work to be free. It takes common sense, work ethic, a willingness to be dirt poor, but to be free, a willingness to buck the culture, a willingness to be different. Last night I read a story that was up on the Blaze. I think it's still up there. It's about a woman who lived cash-free for 16 years. She lives in Germany. She hasn't used cash in 16 years. I got news for you. I read the story last night. I'm like, I don't want to live like her. But I contend she's free. I contend she's one person in Europe that's not worried about the collapse of the euro. They're like, we can do it. Not a problem. We are experiencing slavery, just a different kind of slavery now. But this slavery is different because we brought this on ourselves. It's totally self-imposed, and the shackles can be broken only by us. Adidas, I think you made perhaps the most appropriate shoe for the American citizen in 2012. Will it still be appropriate a year down the road or 2 years? May I suggest, if it is, here's a new product for North Face. I mean, you might as well have the matching gloves, America. There are many kinds of freedom, many kinds of slavery. Freedom comes at a cost, responsibility. Slavery, this kind of slavery comes with a carrot at the end of the stick. Just come walk over here. Just walk over here. Why don't it be fine over here? Then I'll give you the carrot. America, the shoes tell the whole story. We are willingly enslaving ourselves.